The letter arrived without a return address, folded crisp and official, like it had been waiting years to ruin me. You are hereby ordered to relocate your cabin 20 feet east, to comply with HOA regulations. 20 feet, that was the length of a grave. But when the surveyor came, his map showed something no one expected. The entire street, their houses, fences, driveways, and gardens was sitting on my land. Elias Brandt had always thought of the cabin as more than timber and nails. It was the only place that had ever truly belonged to him. He had raised its walls with his own hands 30 years ago, his wife Margaret steadying the ladder when he climbed, her laughter echoing through the clearing when he swung the hammer to hard and missed. She had carved her initials into the kitchen window frame one summer evening, when the paint hadn't yet dried, and every spring she planted roses along the porch, stubbornly coaxing color from the stony earth. Even now, years after her death, the flowers bloomed faithfully, their roots deep and unyielding. As though they understood what it meant to stay, the cabin stood at the edge of Pine Hollow, a community that had once been nothing but scattered farmsteads, before developers carved it into a neighborhood with curving cul-de-sacs and a glossy Homeowners Association. Elias never joined their barbecues or town hall meetings. He sold his woodwork quietly in town and kept to himself. The neighbors said he was eccentric, a hermit clinging to old ways. He didn't care. The cabin wasn't just a house, it was the last living part of his wife, and he wasn't about to surrender it to gossip or regulations. It was on an otherwise ordinary morning, with fog drifting low across the tree line, that the letter came. The envelope had no return address, only his name printed in sharp, machine-cut type. He slid it open with the edge of his pocket knife, and as he unfolded the page, the air in the cabin seemed to tighten. You are hereby ordered to relocate your dwelling 20 feet east to comply with the boundary ordinances and architectural integrity of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association, 20 feet. The phrase glared at him from the page like an insult. Elias read it again, slower this time, but the words didn't change. Move his cabin, the house he had built with his wife's hands beside his. 20 feet, as though it were some misplaced toy. His fist curled around the paper until it crumpled. He tossed it onto the table and stood, pacing the length of the small living room. His boots thudded against the old pine boards. The cabin had survived blizzards, storms, even a wildfire that once licked the ridge. It would not be moved for a committee of suburbanites who measured life in lawn ornaments. And holiday-like competitions died outside. The air carried the sharp scent of resin and wet soil. Across the gravel road, he caught sight of Mrs. Cleary, one of the HOA regulars, walking her dog. She saw him and looked away quickly, tugging the leash tighter. The whispers had already begun. He realized they thought he would fight it, and they were probably hoping he'd lose. That night he sat at the kitchen table with the letter laid flat before him. The lamp cast shadows across the creases in the paper. He thought of Margaret, how fiercely she had defended this land when developers first started circling. This is ours, she used to say, kneeling among her roses. Let them pave everything else, but this little patch stays. He had promised her then. Promises weren't something you shifted 20 feet at a stranger's demand dot by the end of the week. The HOA sent a surveyor. Elias was outside splitting logs when the truck arrived. Its logo painted in blue, Stanton Land and Title Services. A man climbed out, tall and spare, with a clipboard tucked under his arm. You Elias Brandt? The man asked. Elias nodded, setting the axe aside. Name's Greg Halpern. Got orders to verify property lines. Routine thing. Elias grunted. Routine, huh? Strange how routine always means trouble. Halpern gave a thin smile and got to work. He moved with efficiency, setting up a tripod, sighting through lenses, placing bright orange flags in the soil. Elias watched from the porch, arms folded across his chest. The forest hummed with insects, and the sound of the surveyor's measuring tape snapping shut punctuated the silence. Hours passed. Halpern's expression shifted from casual to tense as he scribbled notes. He measured again, double-checking, moving farther down the road toward the line of houses that made up Brookside Lane, the neat, uniform street the HOA boasted about in their newsletters. Elias noticed the surveyor's pace slow, his face drawn as though he'd stumbled on something unpleasant. Finally, Halpern packed up his instruments. He didn't immediately approach the porch. Instead, he lingered by his truck, flipping through pages, muttering under his breath. Well, Elias called, his voice carrying across the clearing. Halpern hesitated, then walked over. Mr. Brandt, this is irregular. He tapped the folder. Your cabin's fine. Dead on, actually. Set square with the deed. Elias raised an eyebrow. So I don't need to move it 20 feet. No, sir. Halpern shifted uneasily. According to my measurements, the street the whole of Brookside Lane is built on your parcel. Every lot, every driveway. They're not just encroaching on the boundary. They're sitting smack in the middle of your land. Elias stared at him, letting the words sink in. The forest seemed to still around them, even the cicadas going quiet. You're telling me, Elias said slowly, that the HOA is accusing me of encroachment while their whole damn street is trespassing onto my property? That's the long and short of it. Yes, Halpern swallowed. I'll file the official report, but you should keep a copy. Things like this don't get swept under the rug easily. Elias felt a grim smile tug at his mouth. He took the folder, the papers still warm from the surveyor's hands. The black lines and numbers looked stark against the white page, undeniable later that evening. A knock sounded at his door. When Elias opened it, there stood Gerald Minton, the HOA president. Gerald was a man built of polished surfaces, neat hair, pressed slacks, the kind of smile that felt more like a weapon than a greeting. Behind him loomed a board members, arms crossed. Evening, Mr. Brandt, Gerald said smoothly. I understand the survey was completed today. Elias didn't invite them in. He leaned against the frame, the survey tucked under his arm. It was, and it says my cabin's fine. Dead center. Gerald's smile didn't waver, though his eyes flickered. Well, surveyors make mistakes. Boundaries are complicated things, easily misread. Elias pulled the papers free and held them up. Doesn't look complicated to me. Your whole street's the mistake. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Gerald, however, only smoothed his tie. Mr. Brandt, I urge you not to misinterpret. Pine Hollow functions best when everyone cooperates. You wouldn't want to create unnecessary tension. I didn't create anything. Elias snapped. You brought this to my door, and I'll be damned before I move this cabin an inch. For the first time, Gerald's smile slipped. Just barely. His voice dropped, soft and deliberate. Careful, Mr. Brandt. Some truths aren't meant to be unearthed. It's better to live in harmony, don't you think? Elias held his gaze until the man turned, retreating down the steps. The board members followed, their silhouettes swallowed by the dusk. The roses on the porch swayed in the night breeze, their petals catching the last of the light. When Elias shut the door, he pressed his hand to the window frame, feeling the grooves of Margaret's initials carved there decades ago. The paper crinkled under his other hand, the survey solid and undeniable. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, not fear, but a fierce kind of purpose. The HOA thought they could bully him with letters and rules. They thought he was just an old hermit clinging to a patch of land. But they didn't understand. This wasn't just land. This was memory. This was promise. And if their whole street was trespassing on his soil, then they just picked a fight with the wrong man. Chapter 2, the resistance, a first sign that things had changed, came with the sound of footsteps on gravel at midnight. Elias had been awake, working a block of cedar into shape at his bench, when the crunch of shoes outside pulled him toward the window. He extinguished the lamp and listened. A pair of shadows moved past the porch, lingering along, whispering in voices too low to catch. When Elias opened the door, they scattered like startled deer, leaving only the sharp stink of cigarette smoke drifting in the night. By morning, he found the roses Margaret had planted trampled flat, their stems broken as though under deliberate boots. He stood over the wreckage, jaw clenched, one hand gripping the porch railing until his knuckles whitened. His wife's roses had survived storms and droughts, but not neighbors who had decided he was the enemy. The following days brought more of the same. Strange cars idled on the road at odd hours. Once, when Elias returned from town, he found the back door of the cabin ajar. Though nothing had been taken, just disturbed, shifted slightly, as if someone had walked through, measuring how easily they could strip him bare. A random inspection notice appeared in his mailbox, citing concerns about firewood stacked too close to the structure. Another warned about the unsightly condition of his roof shingles. Each letter bore the HOA's letterhead, each signature a reminder that they were watching him. Elias read them in silence, then fed them one by one to the stove until the paper curled and blackened. Let them watch. He had weathered worse storms, but beneath his defiance, a thread of unease wound tighter. It wasn't just the whole board or their rules. He felt it in the way the neighbors avoided his eyes now, their steps quickening when they passed his property. Fear clung to them, but not the kind that came from property disputes. It was deeper, older, as if they all carried knowledge of something that Elias hadn't yet uncovered. At night, he found himself returning to the memory of Margaret. He would lie awake on the narrow bed, staring at the rafters, and recall the early days of the cabin. She had stood barefoot in the dirt, tracing the outline of the foundation with her hands, grinning like a child. "This is our place, Eli," she'd said. "No landlords, no city men, just us and the trees." He remembered the first winter, when snow pressed against the windows and the fire barely held. She had cooked over the stove while he sealed cracks in the walls, and they laughed at how unprepared they had been. But they endured, and when spring came, she filled the yard with roses. "Let them build their concrete jungles," she'd whisper, dirt under her nails. "We'll stay free." It had been her dream to keep the world's corruption at bay. Elias had promised to uphold it, and now, as the HOA tried to push him off the land, the promise returned with a ferocity that burned in his chest. He would not move. He would not surrender still. Defiance alone was not enough. Elias needed proof. He drove into the county seat one morning, the old truck rattling down the two-lane highway, and made his way into the record's office. The building smelled of dust and ink, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. A clerk led him to the archives, where rows of leather-bound deed books lined the shelves. Elias pored over them, tracing parcel lines back decades. His fingers smudged with ink as he copied maps onto notepaper. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. His property extended far beyond what the HOA claimed. Brookside Lane, the street line with identical houses and flagpoles, had no legal foundation. It had been carved directly out of his land sometime in the 1980s, slipped into existence through what looked like forged filings and conveniently missing signatures. He sat back in the stiff wooden chair, hard hammering. This wasn't just a mistake. It was theft. Someone, long before Gerald Minton's tenure, had built a neighborhood on ground that didn't belong to them, and the entire HOA was complicit, whether knowingly or not. Driving home, Elias felt the weight of the deeds in his satchel, as heavy as stone tablets. With this proof, he could ruin them. He could drag their carefully planned street into the light and show the world it was a fraud. But as the pines closed in around his truck and the familiar curve of the cabin appeared, a chill worked its way up his spine. If it were only about land, they would fight him in court. But they were not only trying to intimidate him, they were trying to silence him. That night, rain drummed against the roof as Elias sat on the porch, smoking his pipe. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. He had just tamped the ash when a beam of headlights appeared on the road, slowing near the cabin. The vehicle didn't pass. It pulled over and idled, engine humming low. Elias rose, every muscle tensed. He reached for the axe leaning by the door and waited. After a moment, the driver's side door opened, and to Elias's surprise, it was the surveyor Greg Halpern. The man looked pale in the wash of his dashboard light, his movements jerky as though he were afraid to be seen. "Mr. Brandt," Halpern whispered urgently when Elias approached, water dripping from the brim of his cap. "We can't talk long. They don't want me here." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What's this about? Your report was clear enough." Halpern shook his head, glancing over his shoulder toward the empty road. "You don't understand. It's not just about the property lines. It's about what's under them." Elias felt a cold weight drop into his stomach. Under them? The surveyor's hands trembled as he fumbled with his clipboard. "When I checked the soil markers, there were anomalies, disturbances that shouldn't be there. Whole sections of ground that read hollow, like the land was covering something. I tried to log it, but Stanton's office told me to erase the notes. They said the client your HOA already knew." Rain streaked across the windshield of Halpern's truck, blurring the glow of his interior light. His face looked carved out of fear. "They don't want this coming out. Not the land theft. Not the rest. I've been warned already. If they think you're digging, they'll—" He broke off, his breath quick and ragged. "I shouldn't even be here." Before Elias could speak, Halpern shoved a folded slip of paper into his hand. "That's all I can give you. Don't look for me again." He scrambled back into the truck, slammed the door, and sped off. Taillights vanishing into the rain dot, Elias unfolded the paper with shaking fingers. Scrawled in hurried ink was a set of numbers, coordinates perhaps, and 3 words beneath: "Don't dig here." The storm swelled overhead, thunder rolling through the valley. Elias stood alone in the rain, the slip of paper bleeding ink in his palm, the roses at his feet flattened by water. The cabin loomed behind him, steady as ever, but for the first time, The land itself seemed to pulse with uneased. It was no longer just a fight over 20 feet, no longer even a battle over stolen land. Whatever was buried beneath Brookside Lane was darker, older, and far more dangerous than Elias had imagined. And now, he realized, the HOA wasn't merely protecting their property. They were guarding a secret that had slept under their foundations for decades. Chapter 3. The secret beneath coordinates Halpern had scribbled on a damp slip of paper stayed with Elias like a thorn beneath the skin. He tucked it into his pocket, memorized the numbers, and found himself pacing the cabin each night, pipe cold between his teeth, as if the walls themselves urged him to act. By the third evening, he gave in. He laid out maps of Pine Hollow across the table, county surveys, topographic charts, photocopies of the deeds he'd unearthed. Lines overlapped in confusing patterns, but when he pressed Halpern's coordinates against them, a strange alignment appeared. The numbers fell squarely beneath Brookside Lane, directly where the neatest houses stood, identical lawns glowing under their porch lights. Elias stared at the map long into the night. The hollow readings Halpern had mentioned, the way the neighbors averted their eyes, it all pointed to something buried, something more permanent than stolen land. The next morning, Elias set out along the forgotten trails that wound deeper into the forest beyond the HOA's reach. The air carried the musk of damp leaves, and fog hung low, curling between trunks like restless spirits. He followed paths no one had used in decades, the ground soft with moss, until he found a clearing marked by half-buried stones. Time and weather had eroded their faces, but when Elias crouched and brushed away the soil, faint etchings emerged, names, dates, scratched crosses. They were gravestones, dozens of them, scattered in the brush, swallowed by roots. A memory stirred Margaret, years ago, telling him about an old story she'd heard from a farmer at the feed store. A fire had swept the valley in 1907, destroying everything in its path. Dozens had died, their remains buried hastily in a mass grave when disease spread through the ruins. The land remembers, she had whispered then, her hand pressed to the soil. It always remembers. Elias rose, his chest tight. The graves stretched farther than he could see, and when he traced their direction on his map, they pointed straight toward Brookside Lane. The realization struck cold. The HOA had built their perfect little community on top of a burial ground, and they had known. That evening, Elias walked into the HOA board's monthly meeting. It was held in the community center, a low brick building that smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee. Folding chairs formed neat rows facing a podium, and the board members sat behind a long table, papers stacked in front of them. Neighbors filled the chairs, murmuring among themselves until Gerald Minton rose and tapped the microphone. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," Gerald said smoothly, "we have a special appearance." His eyes swept the room and landed on Elias. "Mr. Brand has some concerns he wishes to share." Elias felt the weight of dozens of stares as he stepped forward, the survey and copies of old maps clutched in his hands. He laid them on the table in front of the board. "You accuse me of encroachment," he said, his voice low but steady. "But the truth is, your whole street is the trespasser. Brookside Lane was built on my land, stolen through forged filings. And worse," he paused, scanning the crowd, "you built on graves. This valley burned in 1907. The dead were buried beneath the soil you paved over. And you knew it." A murmur swept through the room. Several neighbors shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the floor. But Gerald only leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "The practiced calm of a man used to controlling a narrative. Mr. Brandt," he said with a faint smile, "it's admirable that you care so deeply for history, but your claims are sensational, fabricated, even. The fire was tragic, yes, but it happened miles from here. And as for the deeds, old maps are notoriously unreliable." He lifted one of Elias's papers and let it flutter back down. "You've spun a ghost story, nothing more." The board members chuckled softly, and a few neighbors followed suit, though their laughter sounded forced. Yet Elias saw what Gerald couldn't conceal, the flicker of fear in his eyes, the stiffness in his jaw. "You can laugh all you want," Elias said, his voice rising, "but the land doesn't lie. I've seen the graves, and soon everyone else will too." The room fell silent. Gerald's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, then returned. "Meeting adjourned," he declared abruptly, ignoring the agenda. "Thank you all for coming." Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the crowd dispersed in hurried whispers. Elias stood alone at the front of the room, the weight of their hostility pressing on him. He gathered his papers slowly, feeling their eyes on his back. That night, The retaliation began. He woke to the crackle of fire outside his window. His fence, the cedar posts he'd cut and set with Margaret 20 years ago, burned in jagged orange tongues. Elias grabbed a bucket, dousing the flames with water until his arms shook. When it was out, he found the remains of a gasoline can tossed into the grass. The next morning, his workshop door was ripped from its hinges. Tools he had spent a lifetime collecting, planes, chisels, the saw Margaret had gifted him their first Christmas, were gone. He sank to his knees amid the wreckage, grief flooding him like a tide. They weren't just trying to drive him out. They were trying to erase him. But Elias did not bend. He rebuilt the fence with what he had left. He repaired the door with iron nails. Each act of defiance felt like striking back against an unseen hand. His wife's roses, though flattened by the storm, showed new shoots. He tended them carefully, whispering to them as Margaret once had. "You see," he murmured, "we stay. We endure." The pressure grew. Cars tailed him when he drove into town. Anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox. "Leave while you can." Rocks shattered his windows at night. Yet Elias remained rooted. One evening, he returned to the clearing of gravestones. Kneeling in the dirt, he traced the faded names, his breath clouding in the chill air. Thomas H. Weller, Margaret and Klein, Samuel Frost, dozens more, each one forgotten, paved over by the HOA's lies. He spoke aloud, his voice rough but certain. "I won't let them bury you twice." As he rose to leave, he caught sight of something glinting among the roots of a fallen oak. He dug with his hands until his fingers closed on a tarnished metal tag, the kind used in old burial sites. Stamped into it were numbers that matched Halpern's coordinates. The land itself was guiding him. Proof lay everywhere, if only he brought it into the light. Days later, Gerald appeared at the cabin again. He didn't bother knocking. He walked onto the porch with two men in suits flanking him, their expressions hard. "You're making this worse than it has to be, Brant," Gerald said. "You've stirred up the neighbors. You're dredging up stories that should stay buried. If you care at all about your wife's memory, about peace, you'll stop now." Elias stepped forward, unafraid. "My wife believed this land was sacred. She believed promises mattered. I made her one. And I'll die before I let you take this place from me." For the first time, Gerald's veneer cracked. His smile vanished. His voice dropped, sharp as broken glass. "Then you'll regret it." He turned and strode away, the men following. Elias watched them vanish into the trees, the silence heavy with threat. He closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. The fight had shifted beyond boundaries or deeds. Now it was war between truth and concealment, between the living and the restless dead beneath the streets, and Elias, bound by memory and promise, would not yield. Chapter 4. The Choiselius worked like a man possessed. Days and nights blurred together as he gathered everything he had: the surveyor's report, the copies of the original deeds, the county maps showing Brookside Lane stamped where no street should be. But paper wasn't enough. He needed proof that could not be argued away, proof carved into the ground itself. So he took photographs, first of the gravestones in the woods, their faces worn but still legible under the moss. Then, late one night, he crept down Brookside Lane. He waited until the lights in the houses flickered out, until the cul-de-sac lay silent. There, under the dim glow of a street lamp, he knelt at the edge of a driveway where rain had washed the soil thin. And there was bone-white stone poking through the earth, the edge of an old grave marker, half buried beneath the asphalt. His hands shook as he brushed dirt from the engraving. A name stared back at him: Sarah Wells, 1907. He snapped photographs until his fingers were numb from the cold. The camera flash lit the drive like lightning, each burst exposing what the HOA had tried so hard to keep buried by dawn. He had enough to bury them. The journalist he chose was not from the local paper that rag-folded itself around the HOA, like a protective blanket. Instead, Elias drove 3 towns over, to a small but stubbornly independent weekly run out of an old bank building. Its editor, Rachel Klein, was known for chasing the stories no one else dared touch: corruption, poisoned wells, politicians caught with dirty hands. He placed a stack of deeds, maps, and photographs on her desk. She flipped through them in silence, her eyes narrowing as she studied the grainy pictures of gravestones beneath driveways, of maps showing land theft, of the surveyor's report marked with official seals. "This," she whispered, pushing back her glasses. "This is dynamite." "It's the truth," Elias said simply. Rachel looked at him, measuring. You know what will happen if I print this, right? The whole won't just go quietly. You'll be hated even more than you already are. I've been hated before, Elias replied. His voice was steady, but inside, he felt the old ache of Margaret's absence. What matters is that they don't bury the dead twice. Rachel held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. I'll run it. Front page, the fallout was immediate. By the following week, the story spread across the county. Headlines screamed, community built on mass graves. Survey reveals decades of land fraud in Pine Hollow. HOA faces legal firestorm over buried truth. Reporters descended on the quiet neighborhood, their vans clogging the manicured streets. Neighbors who once looked through Elias as though he were a ghost now shuttered their blinds, afraid to be seen. Some shouted at the cameras, others wept on their porches. One by one, the houses of Brookside Lane became stages for public shame. The county sent investigators. Lawsuits stacked like cordwood. The State Historical Society moved to condemn the street, citing desecration of a burial site. Fines landed like hammer blows. Board members resigned in disgrace. For the first time in decades, the HOA's iron grip cracked. Elias watched it all unfold from the porch of his cabin, the roses blooming stubbornly at his feet. He felt no joy in their downfall, only a grim satisfaction that the truth, at last, had surfaced. But Gerald Minton was not finished. It was a week after the story broke when Gerald came to him one final time. Elias was repairing the roof shingles, hammer steady in his hand, when he heard the crunch of gravel below. Gerald stood in the clearing, no longer dressed in his immaculate suit, but in a wrinkled shirt and slacks. His hair damp with sweat. The arrogance had drained from him, leaving something raw and desperate. I need to talk, Gerald called up. Elias descended the ladder slowly, Axe still leaning by the porch. He didn't invite Gerald in. The man's eyes darted to the roses, the etchings on the cabin windows. Then back to Elias. You've made your point. You've exposed everything. The lawsuits, the investigations, they'll ruin me. Ruin all of us. But it doesn't have to go further. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and held it out. This is a deed transfer. The entire street, Brookside Lane. I'll sign it over to you. Every lot, every house. It'll all be yours. You can sell it, tear it down, keep it as a monument, whatever you want. And money, as much as you need. His voice broke slightly. Just stop talking. Stop pushing this. Let it die where it belongs. Elias stared at the envelope. For a moment, he thought of what it might mean. Power, wealth, the chance to control the very people who had tormented him. A part of him even imagined Margaret smiling, teasing him for finally owning the whole hollow. But then he looked at the roses, blooming defiantly against the charred remains of the fence they had burned. He touched the initials carved into the window frame. He remembered the graves in the woods, the forgotten names under driveways, the surveyor's haunted face. He shoved the envelope back into Gerald's chest. This land isn't for sale. Not the cabin, not the graves, not 1 inch of it. His voice was steel. It was never about money. It's about memory. It's about justice. And it's about a promise I made to my wife. You and your lies can't buy that. Gerald's face crumpled. Fury and despair warring across his features. For a moment, Elias thought the man might strike him. But then Gerald simply sagged, clutching the envelope like a shield. He turned and walked down the gravel drive, shoulders hunched. The last Elias ever saw of him was the figure shrinking into the trees, swallowed by the land he had tried so hard to control. Weeks passed. The investigations tore the HOA apart piece by piece. Some residents fled before condemnation notices arrived. Others stayed, too stubborn or too ashamed to leave, their lawns growing wild, their houses slowly decaying under the weight of secrets unearthed. One by one, the street emptied. Elias walked the property line at dusk, his boots crunching the soil. The once proud houses of Brookside Lane loomed silent, windows dark, their driveways cracked and weedy. They looked less like homes and more like tombstones, monuments to arrogance and denial. The cabin stood untouched, its chimney sending a curl of smoke into the evening sky. The roses flourished along the porch, red blooms glowing in the fading light. Elias paused there, hand resting against the window frame, tracing the grooves of Margaret's initials. I kept the promise, he whispered. The words drifted into the twilight, carried on the same air that had once held her laughter. The land was quiet again, but it no longer pressed on him with the weight of secrets. The dead had been acknowledged, the lies had been broken open, and the cabin his cabin remained, unmoved, eternal dot at the end of the hollow. where Brookside Lane sagged into silence. The last light came not from a street lamp or a manicured lawn. It came from the windows of Elias's cabin, warm and steady, shining against the darkened street like a vigil flame. The fight was over. The land was his, and the promise was kept.